So I guess very happy to have all these experts here, and I guess we will have our sessions. They'll have a time to speak. We'll have some discussion among the panel, and then at the end there will be time for audience questions. So at the end, please feel free, even throughout, to pop questions in the Q&A section as an audience member, and we can try and address those as we speak to the panel a little later on. So I'll just give a brief introduction to what DConnect is about, and just not to delay, it's not as focal as what you guys are here for. So we have, I suppose, launched in the last month or so. We're a new organisation, Digital Health Innovation Hub, based out of Dundalk Institute of Technology. And we've been supported and funded by predominantly Enterprise Ireland through regional development funding, and by many of the local groups, government and businesses in the Northeast region. We've support right across the country from different organisations, large and small as well. Digital health being a very poignant and important topic for everybody in healthcare, and for Ireland in particular. You know, building on the expertise that we already have in pharma and medtech and biotech, and also in tech as well, in large technical expertise in IT. So our mission is to stimulate, foster and enhance innovation in digital health for the creation of enterprises and products and services to address the healthcare needs of society. And as our society ages, the burden of care increases over time. So digitization and transformation into digital services, and keeping patients maybe at home, monitoring and care, not having those patients having to travel, etc., should help to increase the care standards, but also decrease maybe the burden on the healthcare system. So we're really a connector. We're, I guess, building a bridge between businesses that are in this space, the healthcare sector, public and private, connection with third level institutes and with society as well. The end user here being the patient, and ultimately everything around this should be patient centric. But a lot of organizations along the value chain here to realize some of these technologies and some of these solutions for healthcare. So we have a cluster that we're building. We have a large number of companies and a large number of organizations in Ireland and overseas engaged at present across startups. We hope to help to commercialize research and support startups in early stage and scale up businesses through mentorship and business support. And we also provide technical expertise as well in prototyping for people that don't maybe have that expertise in-house. And then there's an ability to provide an insight into, I suppose, the leading edge innovations and the technologies that are coming to the fore for some of those larger companies and investors. So our audience is broad. This is a quadruple helix model that would have been developed out of MIT, and these are the components that mean you move in a good direction in terms of innovation in any particular space.
Angela, can I just check with participants if they can see your slides, because I don't think we can see your slides. Can you see them, Tobias? Okay, that's fine, thank you.
It's okay. Yeah, I'm sharing, so I don't have any other recourse. I can stop and start again if people need.
No, that's okay, as long as everyone can see the slides, thank you.
All right. Yeah, so you can see here that we have, entrepreneurial community engaged, and we're supporting a number of different businesses at present. Also engaging the corporates with a lot of those very much interested in the digital health advancement, and SMEs, some of whom would be moving into the healthcare space, or others who have technology and want to apply that in their technology into the healthcare setting. So again, can't be done without some of the supports from government and capital investment, and of course, many of those innovations coming through from collaborations in the third level sector. So essentially, we're creating and have, I suppose, at this stage, gathered quite a bit of momentum and have a cluster across all of these different types of organizations. We're a go-to for people, a knowledge hub the likes of MDR. We're also running a number of other workshops across digital transformation, across data and security, which are very poignant as we've talked to people over the last number of months. So we are a go-to for knowledge. We have a lot of external connections and expertise to tap into as well. And of course, there's some fantastic expertise at Dundalk IT, and we'll have Fergal speak with later, particularly around regulated software. Enterprise building, we have expertise in mentoring and supporting early stage and scale up businesses, so we can support people in terms of getting their market messaging correct, the product market fit, and getting investor ready. And we're all about really supporting any type of change as change is happening so fast and digitization is happening so fast, and supporting this and looking at this on global scale as well, because connectivity is right across the globe. So we are a cluster. We're connecting corporates with that research and innovation and early stage ventures and startups who want to pilot and test some of their theories, I would say, but also some of maybe their prototypes and technologies with clinical sites. So also, I suppose, the SMEs who are moving into maybe healthcare space and also connecting those people into clinical sphere. I think it's really important that you have the end user and others in the clinical setting input into some of these innovations. It's the way large businesses operate, and so too should smaller businesses. And then connecting some enterprises to funding. We've quite a bit of knowledge in terms of how to leverage in some of the funding expertise and opportunities that are available. We're able to connect and support enterprises in availing of that funding, and again, in business strategy. So we do offer mentoring, business mentoring. This is workshops and webinars as well as one-to-one mentoring. We've had quite a number of one-to-one mentoring sessions with businesses to date, and support people, again, if there is an opportunity to apply for funding and helping them with that. We can prototype as well. So we have a number of projects underway where we're prototyping, particularly software for business who may not have that capability in-house. And again, quite interested myself in bringing different types of businesses together to innovate at intersections. So we see this all the time, particularly now in healthcare, where maybe some of the large companies who are med tech based and engineering focused are now looking at relationships with the large tech companies and vice versa to advance some innovations in digital health. And we do enable partnerships. So if we're the people in the center that bring these different entities together, we have to, I suppose, and we will in the future look into running a program to support. We have a sort of modularized webinar series at present, but we provide entrepreneurial support. We're really focused around the customer. In many cases, this is the end user, but also others in between, thinking about the investor that is your customer, thinking about the larger company whom you have to exit to, and many others in between as well. So a lot of expertise in-house on that, and also on market analysis, and looking at the market landscape and competitive landscape, and setting up your value proposition that leads to your messaging and marketing that actually differentiates you in that marketplace, and getting investor ready, depending on what stage you're at as well. And digitization, I think this is happening right across the board, or maybe has happened, but it's surprising actually to see engaging, particularly probably in healthcare. There are still legacy systems, there's still people actually moving to cloud. There's quite a patchwork in terms of progression of digitization, with large businesses and larger entities well advanced and many years ahead of others. So I think we'll probably bridge those gaps as well, bringing in people who have experience of this and best practices. And we have some other webinars and workshops with ECH Alliance and experts internationally to bring best practices around this to Ireland and to the organizations here. And then I think I have many years working with earlier stage companies, and find that sometimes we think of things here in a local fashion, but it's really important to understand that you're serving a global market, and that the market is accessible from here. So understanding the trends in the market is really important, and looking at, engaging international, understanding international standards and pathways as well, in order to be able to go global from the outset. So this is our team, myself, Sarah, who's also hosting, and Surafel, who's hosting the webinar. All of us with different backgrounds and expertise. Surafel is our software expert, particularly in the regulated space, and takes responsibility for much of the prototyping. Is busy with some of those projects. Sarah is our education and community manager. She has a serial entrepreneurial background and a background mentoring in startups. And I have a mix of academia, corporate, and startup mentoring and investment. So a lot of different expertise across the table there. So do reach out to us. We've a lot of different seminars coming up in this month alone, 3 more webinars or workshops coming up. So these can be found, we'll be advertising them across several different social channels, etc. So do register for those. We've had a lot of interest around cybersecurity. So next Monday, I think that recent events in Ireland, but also across the world, and speaking with large and small companies, they really are up against it in terms of cybersecurity. So I think that one's going to be important. We're bringing in people from international areas to talk about their expertise and their approach. And feel free to contact us through the website. There's a contact us form, etc., or even on a generic email or a phone call. So don't be a stranger. And I will stop sharing and hand back across and allow you to do introductions, Sarah.
Thanks for that, Angela. And now we're going to go to Fergal McCaffrey, Professor Fergal McCaffrey of Dundalk Institute of Technology, who's going to talk to us about the background to the framework of medical device regulation.
Have you got slides? Are you going to share the slides, Sarah, there for me?
Oh, I do, Fergal. Sorry, I forgot that I was on slide duty for you. Yeah. Just give me a moment.
Otherwise, there's a bit of a gap there.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Fergal McCaffrey, and I'm from Dundalk Institute of Technology and Director of the Regulated Software Research Centre. So first of all, thanks very much, Angela and Sarah, for inviting me to present here today. This is a topic that I've been looking at for many years now in terms of the area of medical device security, but also looking at medical device software. And in fact, the Regulated Software Research Centre was set up in 2008. And since that, we've been looking at the different areas and different challenges within the medical device industry. And those are the areas that I want to talk about now, as soon as my slides come up here.
That's okay. I'm going to have those for you now in a moment. This is live television, so these type of things happen. Okay, here are your slides. Can everybody see the slides? Yeah. Okay.
You can just move on to the next one there, sir.
Sure.
Yeah, so the Regulated Software Research Centre. So I set this up in 2008. And since that, we have fairly much when there's been a challenge within the medical device industry, we have adopted and tailored our research to look at that particular challenge. So we've worked with industry, we've worked with international medical device standards community, both the standards community itself and also different sizes and shapes of companies, be it from the large medical device manufacturers to software companies that weren't actually medical device companies, but wanted to become medical device organizations as well, or at least supply software to them. So the first area that we looked at really was the area of medical device software development process. Whenever I started looking at this, it was hardware engineers and it was electronic engineers that were fairly much driving the standards within the medical device industry. So then I got involved and brought software engineering best practices to the domain, and I've kind of been working with that domain ever since. The other thing then that, there's a huge challenge for organizations to actually adhere to the different regulations from a company perspective, particularly for small companies. So then we started to look to see, well, actually, are there more effective and efficient ways that you can adhere to the regulations? So we started to look at then, would agile and lean practices be suitable? And we looked a good bit at that. And then, another area that emerged then as a huge challenge for the industry was cybersecurity, and in terms of the healthcare domain, and recently with the HSE as well, we can see the the huge challenge that remains to be. So we done a lot of work around that, and we led 2 international standards in relation to that, and we spun out a company called Novalia that's working with the international medical device community now in relation to that as well. We also worked in done a lot of work around if you're taking a medical device and connected into a hospital network or a medical IT network, what's the risks associated with that as well. And then obviously from a verification validation perspective, the whole software testing and traceability was a big area for us. So initially we would have started out performing basic research, and we would have been funded through Science Foundation Ireland. We're still funded through Science Foundation Ireland to perform basic research. But then we discovered that actually there was a value to the research that we were doing. Companies actually were interested in this. So we started to work in a more applied way with organizations and with the industry, and actually to roll out and transfer our knowledge and our technology out into the industry. And on the back of this, as I've mentioned, we became very active with the medical device international standards community. To date, we would have been successful in taking in around 16 million in funding from the most competitive funding resource research avenues of Science Foundation Ireland, Enterprise Ireland, H2020 FP7, Intertrade Ireland, Interreg, the Disruptive Technology Innovation Fund, and that, and that has really springboarded us forward to be able to help us to solve the most challenging, research questions that are out there within the medical device industry. And obviously that keeps changing. And the next area we want to look at is the area of artificial intelligence, which I just did a discussion before coming on live here in relation to. Sorry, can I move to the next slide there now? Yeah, so as I mentioned, our area is around software really within the medical device industry. This is a very complex area as well. And we've got a complex Rubik's Cube there because there's so many different standards and elements of this. If we're looking at, efficiency, if we're looking at traceability, if we're looking at security, risk management, there's a number of different facets to this, and a whole plethora of different standards that have to be adhered to, depending upon where you're going to market your device, the safety criticality of that device. There's a number of different things that you need to consider. And one of the things that we looked at within our research was how can we harmonize a model that will bring together all of these different standards from a software specific perspective, so that you can actually, look to see what is it that you need to put in place and actually put all of those standards in place looking at the one source rather than looking across a number of different sources. So that was something that was kind of been the bread and butter work that we've built a lot on. A big game changer for us was originally when we were looking at medical device software back in the early 2000s. There was standalone software, was not classified as a medical device. So organizations that were developing
I think Fergal's screen has frozen there. Am I right?
Software.
We lost you for a moment, but go ahead now. I don't think we lost you since organizations that were developing.
All right. Sorry, am I back now?
Yeah.
Were we still on this slide?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm not sure where that was, but in terms of organizations that had been developing software, an important consideration for them was to know which standards to adhere to, in terms of what is it exactly they need to do. Particularly for small companies, that's a huge challenge. What is it they need to do, and what is it they need to address? And that's why we've got the complex Rubik's Cube there, because if you're wanting to adhere to one particular standard, and all of a sudden you need to incorporate another standard, maybe you're going to undo some of the work that you've done already. So what we done was we developed a model called MDevSpace, which pulled together all of the requirements and what needs to be put in place to adhere to those in one place that could be developed with. If we look then at something that actually changed the whole landscape for the research that we were doing, was in the last iteration of the Medical Device Directive in 2007, standalone software could in its own right, without any hardware, be classified as a medical device if it fulfilled the definition of a medical device. In other words, if it could be used for for treatment, for diagnosis, for continuous monitoring, those types of things, then organizations that were developing applications that serve that purpose, were in effect a medical device. If you look at where the role of the Regulated Software Research Centre and what we do with our research is, we kind of sit in the middle, if you like, with the research we do. So if you look at the different types of organizations that we work with, so we'll work along with manufacturers, who are, typically your large organizations, the likes of Philips, Siemens, organizations like that. But there's also small medical device manufacturers that we would have worked with that would have, wouldn't have the same resources at hand. So looking at agile and lean ways of adhering with the standards and practices is very important to them. And that's where that part of the research come in. And then we also work with a number of organizations that, were not medical device software suppliers, never were actually going to, get a CE mark for their device, but wanted to supply software to the large medical device software suppliers. So they wanted to know what was it that they needed to do whenever they're developing their software, that they, that they would be attractive to work along with the large medical device manufacturers. So what we done was we developed a model that would enable organizations to look and see, well, actually, what are the standards that do need to be adhered to, and can we, is it possible to actually take them and put them under one bonnet, if you like, so that we can look in the one place around those. So we developed a capability maturity model around this. But over this last number of years, we've also continually evolved our research to look at as standards have changed, as challenges have changed within the industry, be it, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, risk management, as different things have changed, we've basically brought researchers on board to look at these challenging areas as well. The one consistent that we've always had over this period of time is that we've always worked very closely with the international medical device standards community. And you'll see from the slide that we have in front of us there, if you look at the healthcare domain, there's two parts to that really. There's the whole design and development of the devices, which is basically down the left-hand side there. And then you have the actual usage of those devices within a healthcare setting. So if we look at the top standard that's listed there, we led the development of this, which is the 80002-3 standard, which fairly much took software engineering best practices and incorporated them with the IEC 62304 software development lifecycle standard. And this is widely used within the industry at the minute. The next one then the area to focus on there then as well within that chart was the actual, if you're taking a medical device that has been manufactured from the design perspective, and then it's going to be used within a hospital network, what's the risks of that device on that hospital network, and how does the hospital cater for that? So that's IEC 80001-2-7. And then we looked at the whole area of medical device security. And we worked with the International Medical Device Standards community and the FDA. We're very supportive around this as well, to develop two new international standards and technical reports, the 80001-2-8 and 80001-2-9, which basically look at, what needs to be put in place from a medical device security perspective to be in line with specifically the 19 different guidance or the 19 different areas that the FDA had outlined, because they were at a very high level. So we performed very detailed mappings in relation to that. And as on the back of that then as well, a highly successful and award-winning spin-out company, Novalea, has evolved from the Regulated Software Research Centre, which is now looking at that space. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, sir. Yeah, so just, we're based within Dundalk Institute of Technology, like DConnect. So as we are, a research centre within a college, there's 4 different pillars to what we do. So we look at education, we develop training modules, we develop undergraduate and postgraduate courses, as well as, supervising PhD students as well. So the latest course that we're about to offer next year will be a structured master's healthcare course, which will very much be, part of the course will be taught, but the majority of the course will actually be a structured research master's in the area of healthcare software. So we're fairly excited about rolling that one out. You know, and in terms of the basic research, this is what, you know, everything fairly much builds upon in terms of what we do. As I mentioned before, you know, medical device software process is a key area, but we also look at embedded software, traceability, you know, the area of security, placing devices, medical IT networks. Another area that, you know, we recently looked at as well, which is actually quite important as well, is that, you know, one of the things that got me into medical device software as well was that, you know, there was a lot of issues surrounding failures and defects through medical device software. And, you know, IEC 62304 came into play to help, you know, solve this problem, but it's still happening. So recently then we started to look at developing a medical software defect taxonomy, and we worked with Amy in relation to that, and that has now been published as SW91. So that's another area we've moved to look at. Also, the area of interoperability, it continues to be a huge challenge within the medical device industry as well. So we're researchers looking at that as well. So in terms of the applied side of things, the basic research we perform, we then work with industry to see actually, okay, what we've done is correct from a theoretical and from an expert perspective, but what does that mean when we work along with industry? How can we help companies to be more efficient in actually developing their medical device software and actually to provide better and safer devices in a more timely manner as well? So that's an important part of what we do as well. I'm not going to go through much about the standards because we've talked about them already, but the whole standard side of things is obviously, you know, a strong validation of the work that we do on an international setting. If we could move to the next slide there, Sarah, please. Yeah, so just in terms of the strategy that we have for the center. So, you know, at the backbone of everything we do is basic research. So it has to be well-founded research based upon real need and a problem within the industry. We would work with international experts and standards community to make sure that the research is fully validated. And then we would take that research and we would work with industry through a variety of, you know, funding programs such as the Enterprise Ireland Commercialization Fund, the Enterprise Ireland Innovation Partnerships, more recently the DTIF funding calls as well. But essentially we work with companies. And then on the back of that, then we've spun out a number of companies from the Regulated Software Research Centre, which then stand on their own feet and work with the international medical device community, in addition to the company engagement that we would have from the centre itself. Sorry, sir, if you want to move along to the next one there. Yeah, so, well, like, you know, we perform basic research, but one of the things that we are very keen on is working with industry, and particularly working with industry to solve what we see as the big problems within the medical device software industry. So we're always open to working with companies in relation to that. We have embarked and also completed a number of large projects, small projects with different fund bodies, but we're open to working on you know, Enterprise Ireland innovation vouchers, innovation partnership, even commercialization projects with companies. We're also heavily involved with you know, the LERO, the SFI Centres program, and there is a targeted element to that program where companies can get funded for 50% of the project. So we're open to working with organizations around that. And Sarah also mentioned, you know, that the clustering is an important element, you know, of these presentations that as well. So one of the things that's worked quite well is, rather than a company actually putting in a lot of funding, maybe we can get a cluster of companies that are interested in something similar, where they kind of share the resources from that research project. And it means it's more cost effective for the company as well. We've also worked on a number of cross-border Intertrade Ireland projects, which have worked very well. So we're open to working on those. Likewise, fusion projects and fusion business-to-business projects, where with the fusion project, you have a southern partner, a northern partner, and you have an academic partner in the middle, which tends to be ourselves. And also the slightly larger co-innovate cluster projects, where you work with a number of different companies rather than just one or two companies. And then we've a couple of disruptive technology innovation fund projects, which have been running now for this last, one of them just for this last few months, but another one for this last couple of years, where these are larger projects where we can engage in very meaningful research with industry. And then likewise, we've also embarked on a number of H2020 projects, and we're very keen to work along with industry moving forward to work together on Horizon Europe projects. But the key thing at the back of our mind is that we're always looking to work on, cutting edge research, which is going to make a difference, locally, nationally, and also internationally. So please approach us if you've got any research challenges in the area of medical device software. We're very keen to talk to you. So thanks very much, and there's my contact details. So please give us a shout if there's anything that you think we can help with. Thank you.
Sorry, folks, I was on mute there. Next, we're going to move on to Richard Vincenz, who is going to talk to us from Oriel Statomatrix about MDR in industry. So I'll hand over to Richard. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much. I'll make sure I duplicate this so you can see. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this. I'm Richard Vincenz with Oriel Statomatrix. We're a consulting company based in the United States with offices in different countries around the world. I'm based in the UK. I've been here for a while, mostly working on EU activities. But one of the things that Oriel Statomatrix does is help companies through the entire life cycle. So oftentimes when you work with agencies and consultants, and even within your own organization, they're pretty focused on one area. But one of the things that I want to be able to contribute to this and talking through what Oriel does is we cover the entire life cycle of the product. So when we're looking at software, this becomes quite important, because looking at the overall life cycle. So I'm going to touch on some topics here, just take a few minutes. I'm going to share sort of the compliance issues that companies are having with software that's currently out there, talking about, technical documentation, quality system requirements, because unfortunately what we see is the software development lifecycle often is too late in the regulatory aspect. And we want to talk about how we can get that further up the chain of the life cycle. In basic terms, there's about 3 different types of software out there in the industry. There's the SAMD, which we're going to focus on in this presentation, and the standalone applications. And there's lots of guidance documents that deal with this. The UK has published one. The FDA has certainly a couple, 3 that they published. But probably the main drivers with SAMD products is the 2 standards that are published by 2 guidance documents that are published by IMDRF. Those are free, they're downloadable, so you probably heard of them before. Some of you may use those as your Bible, understanding how SAMD products are categorized. Most regulatory agencies around the world do use the IMDRF guidance documents as a basis. There are a couple other ones, the SIMD, which has become a common acronym nowadays, and this is software in a medical device. So the concepts of software development lifecycle and all that does apply to both SAMD and SIMD. So a lot of the commonality that we're going to talk about applies to that. But then there's a lot of software that's been kind of being raised in the last few years, especially with 1345 is software that's non-product related. And so this is software that's used to develop software. So not only do we have to look at software that's in our medical device or used as medical device, but we also have to look at the compilers and automated test software that we're using to actually make our software, so that there's expectations for validation of those products as well. So one of the challenges that we've been having and working with many of the startup companies, many even existing companies that have been around for a very long time, is trying to understand, is our device a medical device or not? And there's two sort of ways that it can go. So we have the traditional medical device, where you're doing patient monitoring, you're taking patient data, you're doing something with the data, you're giving a diagnosis to the patient, you're giving therapy to the patient. But there's two kind of gray areas. One on the side of the so-called health and wellness. So there's a lot of companies that are developing these software applications that can be used by anybody. You can download the app on your phone and use it. And the question becomes well, is that a medical device or not? And in some cases it is, in some cases it's not. So we work a lot with companies trying to determine whether their device actually fits into this medical device realm definition or not. And then on the other side is the electronic health information. This is becoming more and more important as well, because not only do the medical devices provide diagnosis and therapy, but they also maintain patient data as well. And now we talk about HIPAA, GDPR, where this health information is being maintained. And so there's a gray area between the patient data that's actually sitting in the hospital somewhere and what's actually being done with that patient data. So we work a lot with companies to help define their medical device to ensure that those gray lines become a bit more black and white. So one of the things that's happened, and as Fergal mentioned, back in 2007, when the M5 version of the MDD came out, SAMD was treated as an active device. So as of 2010, when that version became effective, sort of in the last 10 years, software as a medical device in the European Union has really gotten there. And there's many other countries around the world that didn't have any type of regulations regarding software. But what has been increasing over the last few years is the regulatory requirements associated with software. There still aren't many definitions. Some rely solely upon the IMDRF documents. But more and more, the countries are releasing maybe not, say, regulations, but more guidance documents or more position statements on how that is. And then certainly, as we know, the EU MDR with the new version of the regulation has a specific rule for software only applications. So it's the regulatory authorities know that this is increasing, so they're devoting a lot of efforts to creating requirements and creating regulations around these different aspects. So in the EU MDR specifically, what we want to focus on is basically you have Rule 11 now. This is new. Before, under the MDD, software devices were the active devices, and then it was really, most of them were self-certified because there wasn't any clear regulation. So all these health and wellness apps, all of these diagnosis software-only applications, they could kind of say, yeah, we're class 1, put a CE mark somewhere in the About menu, and you can download it to the Apple Store or something like that. Well, the EU has really kind of drawn a line that now we have software that can be classified not only as class 1, but all the way up to class 3. So they have clear definitions in the regulation. And I say clear definitions, they think it's clear. We don't think it's quite clear. But there are a lot of expectations that these software applications do need to fall under some classification. So companies have to do their due diligence to ensure that it's classified correctly. The regulation has kind of been written that you take the most highest regulation or the highest risk and you work down from there. So, the kind of the expectation is that everything's class 3 unless you can prove otherwise. So you have to really, in the European Union, all of these apps that have been out there, all these software applications, really need to spend time looking at their classifications and understand. One of the challenges that we see, probably the biggest challenge that we see with software development and companies coming into the market for regulations, is that they're starting way, way too late in the development cycle, creating the documentation that's necessary. So some of you have probably seen this before. This is the infamous, V model that deals with software life cycle. And instead of starting sort of at the beginning, what we find is that companies have sort of gotten to the point of validation, and they approach us and say, yeah, we have this software application that we want to regulate. And we say, okay, let's see the software requirements document. Let's see the software architecture. Let's see the detailed specifications. And they're like, well, we don't quite have that yet, but we have a great program. We have a great application. And it's really, it's got AI and ML, and it's doing all this great stuff. And we know it's going to be a great program. Well, but when you go and approach the regulatory authorities, you do have to have all this documentation in place. So this is one of the biggest challenges that we see with companies that are developing software applications. They're starting way too late in the process as far as putting together documentation. So in fact, what we work a lot with companies now on is starting at the very beginning. Who are the patients going to be? What is the software actually going to provide? What does the software do? Okay, it has AI. So what is the cycle on that? How often is it going to be updated? Is it self-learning, or is it something that you have to teach the application? Is it something that any user can download and use on their own, or is it something that will be professionally used? So we really work a lot with companies, sort of having them pause and saying, let's look at the software lifecycle, and let's start first with what your software is going to actually do. Because a lot of the software applications, they have great anticipations, but when you go to the regulatory authority and you say, yeah, this is all our software does, then the regulatory says, well, what's the intended use? And the company comes back and says, well, it does all this great stuff. It does all these fantastic calculations, and we have a perfect algorithm and so forth. But then the regulatory authority still comes back and says, yeah, but what is it? What is the intended use? So we work a lot with the companies to make sure that they've identified claims. Is it diagnosis only? Does it do monitoring? What type of results is being provided? Because ultimately we need to understand the classification before we start thinking about what type of documentation that we need to do, especially in the EU MDR, because there are the expectations now that software only applications have the different classifications. And if you're class 2B device, there's a very strong expectations for the documentation that's going to be required. So on the other, what we find is that companies think that this is something that can be done in a few days. Software is fast. Software development's fast. There's no doubt about that. Agile cycles, rapid development, rapid deployment, whatever terminology you want to use, it's fast. But the regulatory world is not fast. There's a lot of people in the regulatory agencies that they look at software and it's still this black box mentality. It's this software does stuff inside of it. We don't know what it is, and so we're not comfortable with that. So there's a huge mountain to climb when it comes to documentation that, many of the companies that come and approach us, we end up having to step back quite a bit to create this documentation because it's not available. And so instead of them coming to us and saying, yeah, okay, we can do this in 3 or 4 weeks, we're saying, no, it's probably going to be 6 to 8 months. And they're like, 6 to 8 months, why is that? Well, because we have to go back and look at all the documentation that we're going to have to be looking at and creating as part of the software development lifecycle. So as mentioned, there's lots of standards that deal with this, IEC 62304, there's ISO standards, there's some IEEE standards. So there's lots of standards that help define what we need to do. Even guidance documents that's been published by like the FDA in the United States. The European Union has said that there's going to be some guidance documents on software that's going to be published and so forth. So when we look at the different documentation, it's pretty clear by the regulatory agencies of what software needs. The issue and challenge that we have with software is, okay, how can we create this documentation? How can we keep this documentation updated when it's going through a very, very rapid life cycle? So there's a lot of activities that are ongoing with products that we have to think about. Specifically in the European Union, we have this Annex 1, 2, and 3. And so this is a kind of a graphic showing you how kind of everything fits together. And so regardless of the medical device, whether we're talking about a catheter, an X-ray machine, a software-only application that's taking CT data to diagnose lung cancer nodules, whatever it may be, they all have to follow this approach. And so unfortunately, what ends up happening is that software-only applications that are moving very rapidly, they kind of look at this and say, well, wait a second, we don't have this and we don't have this. You know, what is labeling? What is labeling for our software-only application? And so we have to do a lot of education, and we have to do a lot of planning to look at the entire life cycle of these products, making sure that this technical documentation is all being created for the device, because ultimately this is what, you know, the regulatory authorities are going to be looking at. This is what they're going to be auditing. This is what they're going to be reviewing. You can sit in front of anybody that you want and say, yeah, our software application does this and this and this, and it does it great, and we have these type of results. But unless it's in this technical documentation, it's pretty hard to convince them otherwise. So just to give you an example of what technical documentation is needed, this is just a very short excerpt of what's needed. You know, the device description, labeling, and the performance testing. You know, so the general safety and performance requirements, interoperability, software and networks. Fergal mentioned that as well. You know, software in the hospital networks. All of these things, software connected to other devices. There's software that talks to other software. There's software that talks to other devices. So all of these activities need to be documented within this technical documentation. And then you have the quality system. So that's just the technical documentation. Now you have a quality system that you have to implement as well. And so under the EU MDR, there's a lot. We've identified about 6 or 7, 8 different key areas. You can see them on the slide there on the bottom right. But the quality system is all interrelated. So we tried to show on the left side, you know, how everything is kind of connected with each other. And so the new regulation really makes it that way, that within your quality management system, these activities need to be linked and related to each other. And the challenge that we have with companies come to us with the software applications, they're like, yeah, we have the software product. And we're like, okay, so show us your design development procedure. Well, we don't have anything like that. Okay, show us your risk management procedure. Well, we have a software hazard analysis. Does that count? Like, well, no, we really need a procedure. So have you done the clinical evaluation? And they say, what is that? So there's a lot of components of the quality management system that need to be considered for this. And then across the world, you know, there's lots of different classifications that have to be considered as well. We focus mainly on the European Union, but kind of the types and the classifications of software, they're pretty consistent throughout the world. You know, if you're talking about, you know, critical care, diagnosing cancer, diagnosing specific diseases, most regulations around the world kind of classify these as, you know, the highest risk type of devices, you know, versus the health and wellness, or just devices that are collecting data for a patient, you know, may be classified as class 1. But we strongly want to emphasize that they're not the same, unfortunately. Some software in some regions may be class 2, and in other regions it may be class 3. So although IMDRF gives a nice categorization of software and what it should be, some regulatory agencies still view some of these applications at a higher risk than other regulatory agencies. So one of the things that we try to help companies really understand is the whole software development life cycle. And so it doesn't matter whether you're using the traditional kind of waterfall approach, where, you know, you have a 6-month or a 9-month software development life cycle, right? You know, every version comes out about every 6 to 9 months. They typically use a waterfall kind of, so you go down the waterfall and you restart again at the top and then go down it again. Versus what we find with many software applications nowadays is using an agile. And again, agile is pretty blanket kind of phrase. You could call it rapid deployment, sprint cycles, whatever you want to refer to it as. But there are software applications that we work with companies that have a 2-week or 3-week or 4-week cycle where they're releasing new versions. So your quality management system really has to encompass and understand how you're going through and releasing software on a routine basis. because unfortunately, one of the things that we look at, and this is from some of the guidance documents, you have to look when we're updating software, maybe we're adding new functionality, which is perfectly fine, but what impact does that have on the regulatory submission? Maybe we're adding new features. Again, what impact would that have on the regulatory submission? And then, of course, fixing defects and issues to correct things that we see that's occurring in the field. And probably the biggest challenge is performance, making the application better. You know, there's so many of these AI and machine language type of applications that are self-learning, that they're teaching itself to be better. So does that require a new regulatory submission? Do we need to do verification and validation? So these are the type of things that we really stress upon organizations. They have to have a good process defined to manage these activities. And then I know that there's going to be a specific one on cybersecurity in a week or so, but just to comment on cybersecurity, this is definitely something that's really important. You know, looking at the 3 pillars of cybersecurity, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and looking at how this all fits into your application, because you don't want to be, you know, the Medtronics of the world having to, you know, have nice letters written by the FDA saying, hey, patients, please be aware if you're using this kind of software, using this device, pay attention because there may be some, you know, potential harm that can occur. So make sure that, you know, looking at the aspects of software development, make sure you start as early as you can and start as early as possible, because what we find is that working with companies is they spend a lot more time and energy at the end fixing things and putting things in place, where if they'd had planning and followed a software development life cycle, it would have been much easier, because this is from a regulatory perspective, it is a marathon. It is not a sprint. It's not something that you can just throw in and put in place. It is something that you need to look at continually from a life cycle approach. There's my information, but thank you very much. And I know that we'll have a panel discussion in Q&A later.
Thank you for that, Richard. That was super interesting, and I'm sure very relevant to all of our attendees. And I would just like to invite attendees to put questions in the Q&A. After we have heard from Tobias, we will go to a fireside chat moderated by the Director of DConnect, Angela Duffy, and we will address your questions and find out the answers for you. So please go ahead and put the questions in the Q&A as we go along, and we'll address those at the end of the contributions from the panelists. So now we're going to move to Tobias, who's going to talk to us about the application of MDR in Siemens Healthineers. Over to you, Tobias.
Thank you so much, and thank you to DConnect and to all the participants for this wonderful exchange. And just to comment, regulatory affairs lives, of course, of a lively exchange of thoughts, how to put an interpretation of a law, because it's publicly available, to life. And for that, of course, this exchange sessions is such a highly valuable. I truly recommend that for everybody who wants to participate in the medical device industry. Now, as Fergal and Richard already explained, since 2007, software can be officially CE marked under the MDD. And of course, the latter regulation, the MDR and the IVDR, took that principle at hand. Just to make that context, that is a unique situation in the European Union. There is no other standalone software that can be CE marked today if it's not remote control software for something else. Why is that? Because software, according to the common rules of the internal market, the Blue Guide, is not a product. Electricity is, and tangible items are. So when we look on coming from the Blue Guide, which poses common requirements to the entire EU single market, and if software was not in mind when that guide was updated at the last time in 2016, well, of course, we have obstacles to identify and interpretation to be done to place software into the market. Yeah. So I'm going to follow through that thought process here, and of course, I welcome any questions and comments. So There's an app for that. As always, you don't need to trust any words that the regulatory affairs tells you. If a regulatory affairs tells you, he needs to have sources, he needs to have references. So I highly recommend the attendees, if you want to play into the medical device environment, there are two hyperlinks which I want to share with you. The first is the European Union's medical device sector landing page, where you can make a good orientation with fact sheets, but also with hyperlinks to the legal texts about the playing field and the games, the rule of the games that you need to play for medical device software. And of course, qualifying aids are also supplied by the US FDA. So there's a mobile website available. Are you developing a mobile health app? Well, here's some guidelines to help you determine which laws apply in order to enter the market in a compliant way. And of course, you don't want to make headlines, yeah. So just to highlight, and connecting to the colleagues before, so Fergal and Richard, the official journal mentioned that software, or the EU MDR and IVDR mentioned that software can be a medical device in its own right. The Rule 11, the software classification rule, is only contained in the MDR. In the IVDR, there is no distinct rule for software because they're focused on the information provided and not directly on the technology applied in most cases. The interpretation of Rule 11 is documented by the Medical Devices Coordination Group, MDCG, in the 2019-11's guideline, which was published in 2019, 2 years after the legal document was published, in order to calibrate the expectations that not everything is actually class 3, but that you should apply IMDRF principles. As Richard already explained, IMDRF is a very, very important cornerstone in global harmonization of regulatory requirements. But of course, just to bring that context or to emphasize that context again, they need to be translated into national law before they can be applied. This translation here in the EU was done through the MDCG 2019-11. And of course, yeah, as member states wanted to have that, this was a motivation from our health authorities in the European Union. Software should have more regulatory oversight when it is qualifying as a medical device. So this is why there was an upflip and a movement to more to the 2A, 2B, and class 3 devices. Well, and of course, the risk class determines the level of external oversight. What does that mean? Class 1, you can self-certify. You have to fulfill practically the same requirement. You need to build up a quality management system, but there's nobody supervising you. So not telling you what to do and what not to do, but there's no supervision in that. From a class 1 with measurement function, sterilized and reprocessable is excluded for software. Class 2A, class 2B, and class 3, you need to have a notified body in place. The supervision of the notified body is gradually expanding with your risk class. So the documentation requirements virtually stay the same in most cases. Yeah? The level of oversight and the level of scrutiny extends. So you have to fulfill more audits and you need to submit more and more documents to the notified bodies. And if you're a higher risk class compared to if you're a lower risk class. There is a NANDO database available. Also here, hyperlink. Don't believe me, there's something else where you can read that, where you can find your notified body. The notified body needs to be designated by European Commission to the MDR or the IVDR, well, preferably both, yeah, and they need to have software and expertise. You can find that with the EMDM code. Now, here's my triangle of my usual suspects. Yeah, it was mentioned by Richard before that innovators and startups come from a technological domain. Yeah. From the left bottom side, technological characteristics are quite known for my software, so I know what it can do and how it can crunch numbers to come to a certain clinical result. Of course, the next question, and ultimately the first question before you start anything else after prototyping, is to phrase an intended use. An intended use is a statement you make yourself by saying this software is intended for doing a certain thing, and it's not intended to do another thing. So if you take a picture of a mole on your skin, and that software analyzes that picture, the intended use could be to identify suspicious moles and to tell you when to approach a healthcare physician. That is recommend treatment actions or recommend diagnostic actions. It would be somehow class 2A, class 2B. So the intended use is not that the software directly diagnoses this mole is cancer, go take it out. So that will be the difference towards the intended use. But the algorithm could actually be the same Why is there a variation in the intended use? Well, because maybe you're missing clinical data for evidence that the diagnostic is as accurate as you need it. Next to that is advertisement and promotion as another discipline. Somebody phrased it as claims initially. So also here, I totally concur that all three dimensions need to be totally in line in order to demonstrate this is your intended purpose, meaning the intended use directs which technological characteristics apply, and this technology might not exceed or may not exceed the intended use. And also you can't advertise something you can't prove and you can't fulfill, period. It's simple as that. So do what you say and say what you do. Now, when it comes to claims, of course, why is the law so stringent? Huh? I mean, we're coming from a world where we advertise virtually everything. Yeah, that was the US liberal market, and those were highlighting examples where we glow with health with violet X-rays, or we smoke a fresh cigarette because my doctor recommends that. Well, today, he or she does no longer. Also, sugars, quick energy to lose weight and consequently eat less has proven wrong. So those were just a few examples about claims where the Article 7 of the MDR comes into play. The Article 7 says, and this is something that is a bit bugging, you may not put anything vocally or written to the outside that may mislead the users. You've got to do a risk assessment on your claims. Yeah, can that be considered as misleading? Do I need to disclaim something? Yeah, you must not create a false impression. Of course, you must not describe functions you do not have. You need to inform diligently, and you need to make an assessment what you need to inform about risks associated with the use or with the not use of a product. And if you fail to inform that, you're violating the law. You're violating Article 7, and you will probably get a fining on that. Yeah? And of course, you should not suggest uses that are off-label, meaning the device was not originally intended for. So think of a catheter that has a rotating blade in a cage in it. That catheter has been designed to clear shunts for diabetic patients undergoing treatment via, what's that called? Yeah, diabetic patients undergoing treatment. Sorry, I'm losing my word here. So that catheter could also be used to clean up other vessels in the human body. Well, was it intended for? Probably not, because otherwise it would have said, yeah, clean shunts and other vessels. Yeah, if you use it in other vessels, and you as a manufacturer would know that, you know of you get word of an off-label use. If you know an off-label use, yeah, you need to react. You need to tell the patient, the persons either to stop, or you need to redesign your product in order to allow that use. Or both are possible. I mean, in the end, it could also be a technological advancement. Somebody talk about clinical evaluation. What is that? Huh? Let's discuss a bit into detail. Clinical evaluation means a scientific approach to demonstrate that the clinical use of your product is safe and effective. In order to demonstrate that, you need to first think of yourself, what aspects of my technology are relevant to a clinical use, and what aspects of my technology are just there because I need it or because it is out of convenience. User management or user authentication protocols are important for cybersecurity and data privacy considerations, but they are not necessarily needed to fulfill my medical intended purpose. So cybersecurity aspects would probably not go into a clinical evaluation document, but which ones would actually be? Well, the MDR and the IVDR share a common concept about something called a clinical benefit. Now, if somebody claims a clinical benefit, that is my clinical claim, yeah. And then there are three categories provided by the law. The first category on the left-hand side is describing the positive impact of a device to the health of an individual. So something that cures me, or something that treats my wounds, or something. Yeah, that is a clinical claim. The IVDR, beg your pardon, looks more into the software field, says it's a positive impact of a device, medical device, software, related to its function to aid to diagnose or to treat. That's more software because they supply information which aid in treatment and diagnosis. Last but not least, that borders a bit more to management systems. If the software has a positive impact on patient management or public health, then of course it's a device and it needs to have clinical evidence. So what does that mean? Think practical. If you've got a pen, you've got a pen. Yeah, you can write words on a paper. If you sell that pen to write words on a paper, it's not a medical device. If you sell that pen and say, yeah, you can mark incisions for surgical interventions where you cut later on, you create a medical device by just claiming that. And if you claim that, you enter now here the characteristics, and then of course you need to ensure that all the requirements are fulfilled. So working on biocompatibility, just as one example. So here everything needs into balance. When coming from software, we discussed briefly also the terms of artificial intelligence or machine learning software. Well, there's a statement paper today out in the European Union launched by the Notified Bodies Interest Group from Germany. That statement paper says practically, well, we acknowledge machine learning technology is out there and is part of medical device software as of today since quite a few days. And we also see that this software has now a distinct property or property which is different from other parts of software. It would practically be able to change itself during use. Notified bodies today say that's probably going beyond the red line of what the MDR has to provide. So if you want to look into software that provides the possibility to evolve over time, always remind that if you change anything that is listed here on the slide, intended use, users, patient populations, safety characteristics, branding, or performance characteristics or labeling, you are about to do a significant change. A significant change in the U triggers a new UDI, unique device identifier, because legislators understand this is no longer the same product, it is a new product. And by having a new product, you need to register it again in national or EUDAMED database. And of course, you need to provide a new traceability. So you need to identify that new product in a different way than you identified the prior product. That is giving certain boundaries just by the law, and of course by the new legislative framework that is behind that law, or how far AI can modify itself. And those are the boundary conditions that you have here. Putting it in positive ways, if you modify the performance in such a way that the characteristics are not relevant to the intended use, so adapt to certain patient needs within bounded performance characteristics, you most probably do not have a significant change. And of course, you should not stop when it comes for scanning for applicable legislations by medical device legislations. Richard already mentioned the GDPR as one of the cornerstones that you need to adhere to. I can completely confirm that. And I would even go beyond. You need to scan also other horizontal legislations. One, of course, the most infamous one that was recently launched by the European Commission is the Draft AI Act in the European Union. That is a horizontal law, meaning it's applicable for any kind of technology that is within its scope and that is not explicitly excluded. Note that medical devices are included and are in the recital mentioned 3 times. So what does that mean? In the end, legislators think that artificial intelligence needs to have a dedicated law. One could think, why not software? And that law is applicable in addition to the medical devices regulation. So consequences, do I need 2 CE marks? Do I need 2 quality management systems now? No, we need to learn, we need to know. Discussion started. The publication has begun in late April 2021, and we are waiting a 2 years discussion before the final law is being published. So let's wait and see, but I recommend you to stay on that pulse. Now, we also mentioned about app stores. Okay, so if I create a medical device, let's say a scalpel in the USA, there's my legal manufacturer, meaning the person who places that product onto the market. I probably need somebody who sells it in the first time in the European Union. That would be the importer. Next to the importer, I definitely need always an authorized representative called the EC rep, who performs the sparring to the national competent authorities and of course assumes the liability in lieu of the manufacturer. And from there on, okay, I could actually distribute that product further. Yeah, don't think about freight forwarders, but think about wholesale distributing models with warehouses. And ultimately, I could bring it to the user. That may be a lay user or a professional user. Secondhand sales is not regulated because it's no longer placement onto the market. Yeah, so that is an opportunity for a green business, of course. Now, what happens if we apply that concept of economic operators now to software? Things get interesting. Yeah? So I have a software manufacturer outside the EU. I do not need to go to the USA. Let's talk UK, yeah, guys, or let's talk Switzerland. So I got a manufacturer in Switzerland who wants to sell in the EU. He needs an authorized representative. He needs a notified body, most probably in the EU. And then what? Yeah, I upload it to an Apple App Store, to a Google App Store, or just on my website. Yeah, forget the app stores. Then it's able to be downloaded by lay users, by professional users. Yeah. So where's the importer? App stores today have the usual business model that they act as marketplaces, meaning they provide a technological framework for somebody else to upload an app to be downloaded and sold via this framework to somebody else. And of course, you can't sell an app, you can't sell use rights, but you can't sell property rights. That was recently confirmed in a Dutch High Court case law. So with that, of course, the question is, the MDR talks about economic operators as well as the IVDR, with distinct responsibilities to secure the entire supply chain and to prevent fraudulent activities. When it comes to software, this interpretation will become interesting. So you need to prepare questions from download portals as well as app stores when they identify themselves as economic operators. So when you upload your CE marked app to Apple, don't be surprised if they ask for a DOC or for any other forms of information to confirm that the product is placed compliant on the market. Legislation here is vague, and I hope that the action plan from the Medical Devices Coordination Group is still online so that we can start this calendar year with discussions. What about app stores and how to fold them under the concept of economic operators? Let's wait and see and stay on the pulse there. Now, when you come with a good set of technology and you want to place it onto the market and productize it, you should not do that before having learned from failures of others. And luckily, there are public databases available which you should scan before and consider those occurred adverse events. Check your product. If that thing could happen, take it into account into risk management, document it, and then act accordingly. Yeah, and this borders back to Richard's comment. Yeah, if you have no documentation, you cannot show that you systematically do those activity when it comes to a procedure. Yeah, if you do not have a procedure, you cannot systematically create a record. If you do not have a record, you do not have any evidence that you actually did that activity. So start writing down. Start with a Word file, start with an empty page, whatever, start writing down what you are doing, and then distinct it further. If you haven't started, you're not ready for the market. Now, last but not least, I just want to emphasize regulatory affairs is all about connection. Yeah, so it's very important to exchange thoughts and to be open-minded when it comes to activities or interpretation of the laws. This is why, again, venues like those are very, very important. I just want to make a small comment to the concept of agility. And when it comes to agility, and this is what Richard already highlighted, is you need to make up your mind first before going into an iteration cycle. When coming out of an iteration cycle, it doesn't necessarily mean that the increment is shippable. So we usually talk about the potential shippable increment after an iteration cycle. So you need to ask yourself, and you need to ask others, is the quality fulfilled? Do I meet all external and internal qualities? Quality conditions, sorry. If yes, then you could show it to the customer and ask about how the feature is doing. If no, don't publish. Go in the next iteration cycle and complete whatever you need to complete. I'm looking forward to your questions and vivid discussions in the fireside chat, although I'm lucky to not have a fire here in my house. Now, this was Tobias Schreik from Siemens Healthineers, co-chair of Medical Software Focus Group. Thank you so much for having me. How do I stop sharing here? Here.
Yeah, have you got it? Okay, so thanks so much for that, Tobias. It was very interesting, very animated, and I would say that our attendees enjoyed that immensely, and I hope that they've got lots of questions for you. So I'm going to hand you over to Angela now, who's going to moderate the panelist discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys, and to everybody. That was really interesting. And we only have one question from the audience, so questions should come in from the audience now, please. But I have lots of questions. So I guess I come from Medtronic years back, and you know, would be familiar with how, you know, the pacemaker and its ability to transmit information was probably one of the earliest devices out there. And it's really interesting to hear Fergal talk about how things are evolving. And we had a discussion at our launch with Anita, who he mentioned, who spun out around cybersecurity. And Anita's take on the cybersecurity piece is that we are only keeping up with what's happening on the outside, and what, you know, technologies are changing and abilities are changing on the outside. So for me, it's just really interesting that you brought up that example, because, you know, very, very early phase right through to now, as you say, you know, diagnostics and people building, you know, a software that is a medical device, and truly for diagnosis as well as everything else. I would have to concur, no matter what I've done, and I've worked with small companies over the last number of years as well, that people don't prepare. People do not start early enough. So can you talk about that? So we have people on the line, I hope, that probably are at this phase. The question actually, which is interesting, I'll bring it up from Francis. It was for Richard, but I think it's applicable to all of you. Is there, or what extent could you modularize an architecture of a medical device so that there are parts with different classes? Now, for me, I'm wondering, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And is it that, you know, Richard or others would say, well, you're trying to sort of get ready your quality management system and do that iterative, don't be ready to push something out if the quality management system isn't in place. So can you talk about that? Is there a possibility of modularizing architecture to try and, I'm not saying beat the system, but comply with the regulations?
Yeah, in fact, there's lots of companies that do that. And depending upon the module, you know, you could end up with different classifications, such as, you know, maybe a module that just does like patient monitoring. So it doesn't do any diagnosis, it just kind of gives information versus, you know, maybe a module that actually does a diagnosis that may be class 2B. But as I emphasized in the presentation, you have to define that yourself early on up front, because if you wait until the end and say, "Ooh, wait a second, you know, we have a system here and everything's going to be class 2B," and you try to go back and kind of remodulize everything, you're just going to end up doing a lot of work, and that kind of defeats the purpose of doing, you know, a efficient life cycle with software.
So that whole piece around intended use, to as well as understanding where your cutoff is in terms of the functionality, the intended use piece is the next piece that you really need to describe and work from there. But there's technical documentation that applies to your software, and there's that quality management set of documents that are required for any submission. You know, there's probably people here that are, yes, I would say, coming from the technical side of things. They start to build. I've come from, you know, working with some of the pharma companies, and, you know, they're looking at, you know, biotechnologies and biologicals, and they're not ready, some of those early stage research for the quality management either. So can you kind of advise people, as you said, Tobias, start writing now, you know, so anything, even, you know, this approach to GDPR as well, get something down and start looking at some sort of process.
I guess modularization can be explained with a laboratory diagnostic machine. Yeah, you have a machine in the central. It takes samples, and based on the samples identification, a specific assessment is going to be made. So I will detect hemoglobin. In the next sample, I will detect another factor like I don't know, oxygen saturation or whatever. Coming from there, it explains pretty much the concept of modularization. You have a central platform in place. Under the IVDR, the machine as a platform takes a lower risk than the assay itself. And the assay itself has a clear own intended purpose. Yeah, the one is to detect hemoglobin, the other is for other factors, the next one is for COVID-19. Coming from here, of course, the risk class of each factor is different, but each analyte or software module needs to be able to fulfill its intended use on its own. There may be technical dependencies to a common platform. And then coming from those technical dependencies, you need to have a look, how big are those dependencies, and is that platform specifically intended to enable the assays to run? If yes, you're not going away with no CE marking, but you can distinct the risk class. In the end, my advice is if you're aiming for a diagnostic system, which you suspect is going to class 3, the iteration cycles are highly depending on external supervision compared to conditions under class 2B, class 2A, and class 1. So that is a software you want to put in a separate module as far as possible in order to have that software in another repeat cycle than the other modules. A second motivation could, of course, be that I have multiple teams working on multiple modules, and they work kind of independently towards one platform. Also, in this case, modularization could be an approach. Yet, as you mentioned, technical documentation as well as the technological characteristics need all be in the same to allow explaining that this is actually a modularization and not a fake drawing on the paper.
Thanks very much. And I think one of the things that struck me is, where we are. Virgil, you kind of mentioned that, you've been working with regulatory authorities for quite a while on all of these different standards. And as things change, different requirements and changes happen within the standards as well. You mentioned cybersecurity and then interoperability. Interoperability is something I hear now all the time, so it talks to, as a software and a device, another network or another device. Where are we at in terms of that at the moment? Where's the trend, I suppose, in need or regulatory requirements around that?
Yeah, maybe just to pick up, maybe just to add to the points from earlier, first of all, just about the actual, maybe the different classifications within a particular device. So, kind of the bread and butter standard that we all kind of need to look at is IEC 62304. So within that standard, it's, the safety classification is kind of made as soon as you've put your architecture in place. So that's kind of at your early stage, really. So at that architecture stage, then you want to segment out what your different modules are and the safety classification of those. I would just give a bit of a warning, maybe small companies that are maybe trying to segregate, and have little experience on this. It's not as easy as it sounds to actually start to segregate out the different modules. And if it is maybe the difference between a class 2 and a class 3, you've got to ask yourself, is this something that you're comfortable with, or is there a danger that maybe you've got this wrong? So it's just something you need to be a bit careful. But in theory, it's possible to actually to segment it and segregate it, at the architecture level, but just to be a little bit careful about that, and obviously this is where Tobias and Richard come in helping with things like that. Back to your other question then, in terms of, how are things changing within the industry? So like the one thing that has fairly much changed the industry quite a bit, quite a few things have changed, but the whole connectedness of medical devices now in themselves has been a big game changer really for the industry. Like whenever I started looking at the medical device software, it would have been a component, an embedded component within a device. We weren't really thinking too much about connected devices now, but all devices fairly much, if they've got a USB port at the minute, if they've got a wireless capability, they are a connected device. And that opens up all sorts of challenges in relation to, not just interoperability, but security as well, and risk management across networks. There's a whole different plethora of things that need to be taken into consideration. And Tobias mentioned there as well about, AI is kind of and machine learning are kind of the big buzzwords within the industry now. And, there is some guidance out, or some, draft documents out at the minute in terms of how devices will be regulated. But I was looking at an article that was published in Nature there last month, and it was fairly much saying that, in terms of the FDA's regulation of AI devices, the devices that have been passed so far have been using data that was, what they suspected that the device, how it would behave. That data has been used rather than data that has been used in a post-implementation perspective. So that is an area that basically needs looking at in terms of, like we would have used IEC 62304 for the whole medical device software development of devices. Well, that isn't completely applicable now if we've got we've got the whole maintenance and change management side of it needs to change quite significantly, because if we've got completely adaptive devices, which I don't know whether we're ready for or not yet within the medical field, there's huge challenges there in terms of the regulators like to see, well, if, they like to know what for a particular input, what will the output be?
Could be.
But if we've got self-adaptive systems that are changing all the time, how do you even start to mandate that? And there's lots of challenges around that. And before we came on the call, myself and Tobias just kind of touched upon that. There's two things. First of all, we need to look and see, well, actually, what could be put in place for the regulators, and then how would you even go about harmonizing that from an international perspective, that you're not looking to do things differently in one region to another region. So that there's a real area of challenge coming up within that. But it's worth the challenge as well. It can really revolutionize the healthcare industry, but it's just, there are hurdles there. And I'd see that as probably the big challenge moving forward.
Yeah, I'm quite intrigued by that one because, as you said, Tobias, you have a new product every time there's an iteration of a sort, be it a bug fix or a change in functionality. You potentially have a new product. And back to my days now, I wasn't regulatory or quality, but you changed anything, even the ink or the components in an ink that was on a label. That was a change that had to be notified to a regulatory authority. So you can imagine the functionality of a device. It's really, as Tobias said, it's a new device requiring a new identifier. And so does that then require a whole new set of documentation, submission, and so on? So I think, Fergal, to your point, and we probably talked about that as well, this is something where, a bit like the agile system that's used in software development, and the sprint system, are you going to have to implement that sort of strategy within the regulatory authorities where they're able to run with an agile system so that changes can be looked at in that fashion? I have some questions here as well I want to put to the audience, and some are answering questions I see typing. Thanks very much. I think, Martin, maybe your question was answered a little bit earlier on. And again, when, Fergal talked about the kind of classification at architecture level, Martin is asking, should a company concentrate on a specific use of their software at the start, even though it could be used as a component of a wider level medical device support or support solution? So, it is going to do its own, I suppose, specific functional output, but would it, be considered in a different fashion later on as part of the system? How would you look at that? Anybody thoughts on that? Maybe Fergal?
Yeah, I suppose from that perspective, it really comes down to its intended use. And, we use the term of, off-label as well. So if you've basically, if your intended use of a device doesn't cover other potential scenarios that it could be used in, it's going to be used off-label. If, outside of that, so it is something you need to take into consideration, that if you're going through the regulatory process, if it is going to be used for multiple different uses, you're going to have to go again. So you want to make sure that you've basically got that covered off.
I can confirm, Fergal.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I can confirm what you just said, Fergal. And just from a practical perspective, one possible solution for that would be, I'm making a hypothetical example. You're starting analyzing an X-ray image, and your software can detect cancer nodules. So that would be the first thing you could detect. The next thing you're about to be detecting, but your software is not ready yet, is pneumothorax scenarios, or maybe emphysema. So that is a new indication for use, and it clearly marks a significant change if you expand your clinical portfolio. Rest assured, you do not want to have the intended use changed every time. So a practical approach could be to phrase an agnostic intended use and expand the indications for use in your documentation over time. Confirming what has said before, each of those examples I just mentioned marks a significant change and ushers in a new product because you change your indications for use and your intended users because the diseases change with the users.
Yeah, and it probably addresses Jakub's question, which is around, how exactly the process of categorization works. And I think you're saying that you're looking at the actual, functionality, intended use right now. The question here is it's almost the opposite of what you've just talked about, Tobias, where maybe the intended use is laid out, or the intention, is laid out in the beginning at the start, but maybe over time, and I would imagine a smaller company with maybe reduced number of resources or financial supports would say, well, actually, I won't maybe meet its functionality that I kind of laid out at the start. How do I sort of maybe downgrade, or how would you work on so decreasing functionality in that case, I guess?
Since you documented everything, you need to flip back and change your documentation. The first question, how the classification process works. Well, first you do qualification. You make a determination whether your product is a medical device or not. And if not, well, you stop there. If a product is a medical device, then you continue with the classification. Yeah, you look on all applicable classification rules, rule out the non-applicables, write this experience down, then walk through all applicable classification rules, explain why the one or other might not be the one matching. But of course, you always need to take the highest rule applicable. This is how you come to a class 2A or class 2B. Now, if you, during your software development, you see that you can't fulfill that feature and you need to flip back to another feature, then of course the design input to that iteration would change, and the design input to the entire product, the software product as such, would change. Yeah. So in essence, you need to flip back and redocument everything and bring everything back in line. That's how life works.
How the medical device industry works, isn't it? And Richard, I know we're over time, but one of the things that intrigued me was that gray area that you mentioned, where, you know, patient data is being collected, maybe in a hospital setting, but transferred to another location. And there's data maybe on a network in a hospital setting, also available at a point, you know, within the hospital, and maybe in a second point within the hospital, and then across to an external point, maybe the patient's own home or a GP or a clinic outside of the hospital. What's happening there? It's a gray area. When will that change, or how is that being regulated?
I think from my perspective, most regulators are actually trying to stay away from that, because that gets into the whole GDPR and what happens to the data. So in fact, organizations like the FDA in the United States have kind of maybe drawn a clear line to that. What we recommend companies do is that within their software application, they themselves clearly define the scope of their software application, what their application does, and also maybe more precisely what it doesn't do. So, and if they have software applications that also manages patient data, because we work with lots of companies that have, you know, EHR, EHI type of backbones, you know, for patient billing and reimbursement, things like that. We also strongly recommend that they clearly define those within the software application, but then they also state, this is not a regulated part of it. This is not included, but at least they've identified it. So then they don't have difficult discussions during, you know, regulatory review.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it becomes a patient data GDPR piece. So it's really intriguing. I think we're well over time. We've answered most of the questions. I have to say, I would love to have more time with the three of you as experts. We'll make the recording available. And we'll have it sort of accessible on our website, but we'll also, you know, if anybody wants to contact any of the three speakers today, reach out to them. I would pull up their emails, but they're probably on all those separate PowerPoints at this stage, but we'll certainly make that available as well. And you're free to reach out to us at dconnect@dkit.ie. Sarah, do you have anything further in closing?
Just to thank our speakers very, very much for preparing such insightful information and presenting it in such an engaging manner. And also I'd like to thank our attendees for coming along today and supporting the workshop. And we are over time, and we have about 2/3 of the people still here. So some people obviously had an 11:30 engagement, but thank you to those who were able to stay on. I'll send you a follow-up email, and if you could give us some feedback on today's workshop, that would be wonderful. And I'll also send you links to book the workshops that we have coming up on cybersecurity, data integrity, and digital transformation in eHealth. We have further workshops coming up in July, August, and September, but those three that I just mentioned are the three immediate ones. So thanks to everybody, and I wish you all a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you very, very much.